The GPS coordinates matched nothing. That's the part I still can't explain to anyone who asks, so I'll say it clearly here at the beginning, because everything else follows from this one fact. On the morning of September 14th, I recovered a vehicle from a submerged canal 18 miles southeast of Henderson Levee. The vehicle was a 2019 Nissan Frontier, dark green, registered to a man named Paul O'Coin from Bro Bridge. Paul O'Coin had been reported missing 11 days prior. The missing persons report listed his last known location as a boat launch near Bayou Benoit, 43 miles northwest of where I found his truck. And his truck was dry inside, not a drop of water in the cab. The windows were sealed, the doors were shut. It was sitting in 4 feet of canal water, but the interior was as dry as if it had been parked in a garage. I've pulled vehicles out of water before. That's not how it works. That's not how any of this works. I should back up. My name doesn't matter for this. I was an enforcement agent with the Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries for 9 years. Region 4, which covers the Atchafalaya Basin. From Simisport down through Butte-La Rose, Henderson, Bayou Sorrel, the whole lower floodway system. If you don't know the basin, it's the largest river swamp in the country. Nearly 1 million acres of cypress and tupelo, braided bayous, backwater lakes, flooded hardwood bottoms. There are sections no one's been through in decades. There are channels that don't appear on the Apex navigation maps. There are fishing camps that were built in the 1940s and have been slowly sinking into the mud ever since, some of them still with curtains in the windows. My job was patrol, mostly boat-based. I'd run the waterways, checking fishing licenses, looking for poachers, monitoring crab traps and crawfish nets, tagging nuisance alligators when they'd get too close to the levee communities. During season, I'd be out on the water, 12, 14 hours. Off-season, I'd do 8-hour shifts, running the same routes, same bayous, same turns. You learn the basin by repetition. You learn its sounds by repetition. After a while, you don't even think about where you are. The boat just goes. Your hands just steer. Your eyes just read the water. I liked the job. I want to be honest about that. I wasn't some reluctant civil servant who hated his post. I liked the solitude. I liked the mornings, when the fog would sit about 2 feet off the water and the cypress knees would look like they were floating in nothing. I liked the barred owls calling at dusk, that 4-note rhythm. Who cooks for you? Echoing across the flat water. I liked the quiet authority of it, checking someone's license, nodding, moving on. It was orderly. The swamp was chaotic in 1,000 ways, but my work inside it had structure, routes, schedules, reports. That started changing about 14 months ago. The first thing I noticed wasn't dramatic. It was small, procedural, the kind of thing that would only bother someone who'd been filing the same paperwork for years and understood how the numbers were supposed to look. I'd been asked to assist with a recovery search. A man from Lafayette, I'll call him Theriot, though that's not his exact name, had gone fishing alone in the basin and hadn't come back. His wife reported him missing after 36 hours. That's not unusual. People go into the basin all the time and lose track of days. Cell signal drops to nothing past Henderson. You get turned around in the back channels and you might spend a night out there before you find your way to a main bayou. So, I joined the search grid. We had 4 boats out, running designated quadrants. I was assigned the eastern stretch between Bayou Sorrel and a feeder canal locals call Little Pigeon, which isn't on most maps. It's narrow, maybe 8 feet across, and then it cuts through some of the densest tupelo you'll find anywhere in the lower basin. I'd been through it a few dozen times on patrol, but never searched it methodically. On the second day, I found Theriot's boat. It was a 14-foot aluminum John boat, plain, no markings, tied, and I do mean tied, with a proper Cleat hitch, to a cypress knee about 40 yards off Little Pigeon into the deeper swamp. The boat was empty. His cooler was on board, still closed, with ice mostly melted. His tackle box was there. His rod was still rigged. A Carolina rig with a live bait hook. Nothing looked disturbed. No signs of struggle, no blood, no damage to the hull. Just an empty boat, tied up carefully, as if he'd planned to come right back. We found Theriot the next day, about 3/4 of a mile south of his boat. He was dead. I'm not a coroner, and I didn't examine the body closely, but I saw enough. He was partially submerged in the shallows, face down, tangled in a root structure. The initial assessment was drowning, possibly a fall from the boat or a medical event. Here's what bothered me: 3/4 of a mile south, through terrain that at that water level was essentially impassable on foot. The water was waist-deep minimum through that stretch. The bottom was soft, organic muck, and the tupelo trunks were so tight together you couldn't move in a straight line. I know this because I tried. After they brought him out, on my own time, I motored back to where his boat was tied, got into the water, and tried to walk the route. It took me over an hour to cover maybe 200 yards before I turned around. And I'm fit. I know the basin. I was wearing waders and had daylight and a GPS. Theriot was 63. He had a bad knee. He was in sneakers. Nobody flagged this. The report said, drowning, accidental, case closed. His wife picked up the boat. Life went on. But I kept thinking about the knot, that Cleat hitch. You don't tie a perfect Cleat hitch to a cypress knee if you're panicking, if you're having a medical event, if you're confused. You tie a Cleat hitch because you're securing your vessel and you intend to return to it. It's a deliberate knot. It means something specific. It means, I'm coming back. I filed nothing about this. There was no place in the report for, I have a feeling about a knot. I let it go. Or I tried to. The second incident happened about 5 weeks later. A family of 3. A man, a woman, and their teenage son had driven to the Bayou Sorrel boat launch on a Saturday morning to go sightseeing, rented a pontoon from one of the outfitters near the levee. They were tourists from Texas. They'd never been in the basin before. The outfitter told them to stay on the main channel and be back by 4. They didn't come back by 4, or by 6, or by dark. Search and rescue went out that night. I was called in around 10 p.m. We ran spotlight searches along the main channel and then expanded into the tributaries. Found the pontoon at around 2 a.m. It was drifting, engine off, key still in the ignition, in a wide section of the Atchafalaya about 2 miles south of where they should have been. All 3 life jackets were on board. The cooler was open, sandwiches half-eaten. A camera was sitting on one of the seats. No family. They found the woman first, the next morning. She was on a mud bank near the East Levee, alive, hypothermic, disoriented. She couldn't tell anyone what had happened. She kept saying they'd stopped the boat because her son had seen something in the water. She couldn't say what. She didn't know where her husband and son were. She didn't know how she'd gotten to the mud bank. She didn't remember leaving the pontoon. The husband was recovered 2 days later, about a mile downstream, deceased. Again, drowning was listed as cause of death. The son was never found. I want to stop here and say something important. People drown in the basin. It happens. The water is dark. The currents are unpredictable. The bottom is soft and treacherous. If you fall in without a life jacket, even in calm water, Panic can take you under in minutes, especially if it's night, especially if you're unfamiliar. These are not impossible outcomes. Any individual case, looked at alone, makes a kind of grim sense. What doesn't make sense is the pattern. Over the next 6 months, I was directly or peripherally involved in 7 missing persons cases in my patrol area. 7. In a region where the 10-year average was about 2 per year, some were fishermen, some were hunters. One was a kayaker, one was a retired surveyor who'd gone out to photograph old pipeline markers. In each case, the vehicle or vessel was recovered in a location that didn't match the last known position. In each case, the vessel was in suspiciously orderly condition. In each case, the body, if a body was found, was recovered at a distance from the vessel that was difficult or impossible to explain by normal movement. I started keeping my own records, not officially, just a notebook I kept in my truck. I'd write down the date, the name if I had it, the last known coordinates from the report, the actual recovery coordinates, and the distance between them. I started plotting them on a map. Not a fancy GIS map, just a paper chart I'd bought at the gas station in Henderson, the kind they sell to bass fishermen. I'd marked the report location with a blue dot and the recovery location with a red dot. Then I'd draw a line between them. After 7 cases, I had 7 lines. None of them crossed. They were all roughly parallel, all running in the same direction, south-southeast. Every single discrepancy pointed the same way, as if something were pulling everything in one direction, like a current, but it wasn't a current. The Atchafalaya flows south, broadly, but these weren't following the river. They were cutting across channels, through solid land in some cases, through areas where water doesn't flow at all during low-water months. The average distance between report location and recovery location was 4.2 miles. The shortest was 1.8. The longest was the Acoin truck, 43 miles. I brought the map to my sergeant. His name was Doucet, good man, 20-something years with LDWF. He looked at it for about 10 seconds and told me that missing persons cases were a parish sheriff's jurisdiction, not ours, and that the discrepancies probably came from bad information in the reports, people filing last known locations, based on where the person said they were going, not where they actually went. He wasn't wrong, technically. That's a real problem with missing persons reports. People say they're heading to one spot and end up somewhere else. GPS data from phones is often useless in the basin because there's no signal. But he was wrong about the direction, the consistency of the direction. 7 lines, all within about 15 degrees of each other. That's not error, that's not noise, that's a bearing. I started deviating from my patrol route. Not dramatically, I wasn't going rogue. I'd just extend a little farther south-southeast on my runs, into sections I didn't normally cover. My patrol was supposed to go as far south as the Bayou Pigeon area and then loop back. Instead, I started pushing past Big Bayou Pigeon, into the lower stretches where the Tupelo gives way to marsh grass and the water gets brackish. Down there, the landscape changes. The tree canopy opens up, and you can see the sky. The sounds change too. Fewer songbirds, more insects, more wind. The water moves differently. It's slower, thicker somehow, more still. There's a section down there, maybe 10 miles south of where my route was supposed to end, where the basin starts to fragment into a network of narrow channels separated by low mudflats. It's tidal influence that far south. The land breathes. At high water, the mudflats disappear, and the whole area becomes one vast sheet of brown water. At low water, they emerge like the backs of animals, and you can see things that the water usually hides. The first time I pushed that far south was in late November. Water was low. The air was cool and flat. One of those Louisiana autumn days where the humidity finally breaks and everything looks sharper, like someone cleaned the lens. I was idling through a channel maybe 10 feet wide, watching the mud banks, not really sure what I was looking for. Honestly, I think I was just trying to see where the bearing led. I found clothes. Not scattered, not washed up, folded. A pair of jeans, a flannel shirt, a pair of white socks, and a brown leather belt, all sitting in a neat stack on a mud bank at the edge of the channel. No shoes, no undergarments. The clothes were dirty, mud-caked, obviously, but they were folded, like someone had undressed carefully, stacked their clothes, and walked away. I took photographs. I picked them up with gloves and put them in an evidence bag. When I got back, I logged the GPS coordinates and checked them against my missing persons notes. The location was within half a mile of where one of my red dots sat. The projected recovery bearing for a fisherman named Hebert, who disappeared in September and never been found. I checked the clothing against Hebert's description. His wife had told the sheriff's office he'd been wearing jeans and a brown flannel when he left. The jeans I found were a 34 by 32 Wrangler. Hebert was listed as 5'10", 170. The flannel was brown. I reported the clothing find through proper channels. It went to the Iberville Parish Sheriff's Office. I don't know what they did with it. I never received a follow-up. When I called to ask, the deputy I spoke with said they'd logged it as found property, and that without positive identification. DNA, dental, something. They couldn't link it to a missing persons case. I asked if they'd run DNA. He said they didn't have the budget for speculative testing on a pair of pants found in a swamp. That conversation is when the frustration started to become something else, something colder. I went back to the mud bank 4 days later. The clothes were gone, obviously. I'd taken them, but I wanted to look at the area more carefully. I brought a handheld depth finder and a longer anchor line so I could secure the boat and wade. The water was still low. I tied up, got into the shallows, and started walking the bank. What I found was this. The mud bank extended further inland than I'd realized. Behind the channel-facing edge, it rose slightly, maybe 2 feet above the waterline, and then flattened out into a roughly circular area, maybe 50 yards across. And in that flat area, the mud was marked. I want to be careful about how I describe this, because I know how it sounds. The marks were depressions, roughly oval, about 18 inches long, 8 or 9 inches wide, pressed into the mud in what looked like a pattern. They radiated outward from the center of the flat area in concentric arcs, like ripples frozen in place. They were uniform, not perfectly, but close enough that you'd notice the repetition. There were dozens of them, maybe 100. My first thought was animal tracks. Alligators leave drag marks, belly slides, tail tracks, but nothing like this. These were too regular, too evenly spaced. My second thought was some kind of erosion pattern, something caused by tidal action or wind. But the flat area was sheltered on 3 sides by channel banks, and the depressions were too deep for surface water movement. My third thought was that someone had done this deliberately, walked across the mud and pressed something into the ground over and over. I took photographs. I measured some of the depressions with a tape measure. They varied slightly. The smallest was about 16 inches, the largest maybe 20, but the shape was consistent, oval, rounded edges, no sharp points or tool marks. Whatever made them had pressed into the mud evenly with consistent pressure. I don't know what they were, I still don't, but I marked the location and moved on because the bearing line didn't end there. It kept going south-southeast. Over the next several weeks, I made that extended run 6 more times. Each time, I pushed a little farther south. Each time, the landscape got stranger. Not in a horror movie way, not with fog machines and atmospheric lighting, but in a geological way. The channels narrowed and multiplied. The mud banks rose higher between them. The vegetation shifted from marsh grass to something I didn't recognize. A low, dark, matted plant that clung to the mud in thick patches. It wasn't hydrilla. It wasn't duckweed. It wasn't any of the invasive aquatics I'd been trained to identify. It was almost black in color, and it had a smell to it. Not decay, not sulfur, something else. Something mineral, like wet limestone, or the inside of a cave. The water changed too. Closer to the main basin, the water is brown, tannin-stained, sediment-heavy, the color of strong tea. Down in that section, the water was darker, not just brown, almost amber in the shallows, approaching black in the deeper channels. And it was warmer than it should have been. In late November, the basin water is typically in the mid-50s. I have a hull-mounted thermometer on my boat. In that area, it was reading 68, 69, once 71. I mentioned this to Doucet. He said there were probably natural warm springs in the lower basin, and that I should focus on my actual patrol route instead of playing Jacques Cousteau. I want to note something about how LDWF works, or how it worked in my experience. We had wide operational latitude. Agents patrolled alone, made judgment calls, operated independently in the field. The trade-off was that the institution relied on trust. It trusted you to run your routes, file your reports, do your job without supervision. If you started asking questions above your scope, the institution didn't fight you. It just stopped engaging. Doucet didn't tell me to stop. He didn't threaten me, or warn me, or get angry. He just deflected, changed the subject, moved on. That's how it worked. The silence wasn't hostile. It was structural. In December, another person went missing. This one was different because I knew him. His name was Ellis Comeaux, and he was a craw fisherman who'd worked the basin for 40 years, lived outside Catahoula, which is a small, unincorporated community on the eastern edge of the basin. Ellis was in his late 60s, tough as a cypress knee, knew the waterways better than I did, better than anyone I'd ever met. He could tell you water depth by the color. He could tell you the season by the sound the frogs made. He had a 17-foot flat bottom with a surface drive motor that he'd rebuilt himself 3 times, and he ran it like it was part of his body. Ellis went out on a Tuesday morning to check his crawfish traps. He had about 60 traps set in a series of ponds off Bayou des Ourses, which is a narrow waterway that feeds into the lower basin. His wife said he left at 5 a.m., which was normal. She expected him back by early afternoon. He didn't come back. I joined the search the next morning. We found his boat by noon. It was in a channel I'd never seen before. And I need to stress that, because I thought I'd been through every navigable waterway in my section of the basin. This channel was about 12 feet wide, running roughly south-southeast, and it cut through an area that I had, on my own paper chart, marked as solid ground. Not marshland, ground. A slight rise between 2 larger waterways that I'd driven past dozens of times without seeing any opening. But there it was. A channel, deep enough to float Ellis's flat bottom, which draws about 8 inches. The banks were sharp-edged, as if the channel had been cut rather than eroded. And the water in it was dark, that same near black amber. Ellis's boat was sitting in the middle of this channel, engine tilted up, Anchor out. The anchor was set in the mud properly. He'd done it himself. His traps were in the boat, all 60 of them. Pulled, stacked, empty. That was wrong. If he'd been checking traps, he'd be pulling them one at a time, emptying the crawfish into a sack, and resetting them in the water. You don't pull all 60 and stack them. You don't have room in the boat for 60 traps and no catch. And why would he pull empty traps? Crawfish don't just vacate 60 traps at once. The boat was dry inside. Like the Aucoin truck, the interior was dry. I got out and waded into the channel. The water was warm, not just warm. I put my hand down, and I would have guessed mid-70s. In December. In Louisiana, December water should be in the high 40s, maybe low 50s on a warm day. This was wrong by 25 degrees. The mud on the banks of this channel had the same marks I'd seen on the flat area weeks before. The oval depressions, radiating outward, more of them, many more. The entire bank, as far as I could see in both directions, was covered in them. They went up the bank and over the top and presumably down the other side. I stood in that channel for a long time, maybe 15 minutes, not doing anything, just standing in the warm water, looking at the marks, holding the gunwale of Ellis's boat. The swamp was quiet. No birds, no frogs, no insects. That's the detail that gets me when I think about it. November and December in the basin. You always hear something, even when it's cold, even when the canopy is bare and the water is low. There's sound, wood ducks, nutria, a kingfisher, something. In that channel, there was nothing. The air was still. The water didn't move. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, which is something I'd never experienced outside of a doctor's office. I reported the boat's location. Ellis's wife came with the sheriff's deputy to identify it. She confirmed the traps, confirmed the setup, and then she said something I wrote down afterward because I didn't want to forget it. She said, Ellis wouldn't have pulled traps with nothing in them. He'd have left them set. He'd have figured they'd fill by next run. They searched for Ellis for 5 days. Boats, a helicopter on the second day, dogs on the levee. They didn't find him. As of when I left LDWF, he had not been found. I went back to that channel 4 days after the search was called off. I went alone, which was against protocol, but I didn't care. I had my sidearm, my radio, my GPS, 2 extra batteries, and a spotlight. I got there around 2 p.m. Plenty of daylight left. The channel was longer than I'd realized. On the first visit, I'd only gone maybe 100 yards in before finding Ellis's boat. Now, with the boat removed, I could run the full length. I idled in, watching the depth finder. The channel was surprisingly deep for its width, 6 feet in places, with a flat, hard bottom that didn't match the soft, organic muck of the surrounding basin. It was clay, dense gray clay, the kind you find in road cuts and construction sites, not in the middle of a floodplain swamp. The channel ran straight for about a quarter mile, then curved gently to the left, then straightened again. The banks never varied. Same height, same sharp edge, same oval depressions covering every inch of exposed mud. The vegetation on the banks was that same dark, matted plant. Up close, I could see it had a structure I hadn't noticed before. It grew in tight spirals, like a fern's fiddlehead, but flattened against the mud. Each spiral was about the size of my palm. When I touched one with a gloved hand, it was warm, warmer than the air. The channel ended at a wide, circular pool, maybe 60 feet across. The water was almost black. I couldn't see more than an inch below the surface, even with direct sunlight overhead. The depth finder read 14 feet, then 16, then jumped to 31, then lost signal. which shouldn't happen. That unit was rated to 200 feet. I killed the engine and let the boat drift to the edge of the pool. The silence was total. The same dead silence from before. No sound at all except the faint creak of the boat hull against the water. I noticed the smell again. The mineral smell, stronger here, like the air itself was heavier, thicker, carrying something in it that I couldn't identify. Not unpleasant, exactly. Not a warning smell. More like a basement smell, or the way the air changes when you walk into a cave system, cool and dense and old. At the edges of the pool, half submerged in the dark water, I could see objects. I got the spotlight out even though it was daylight, because the surface reflection made it hard to see. I angled the beam down and forward. Clothing, more clothing, not folded this time, draped over the mud and roots at the waterline as if it had been laid out carefully. I could see denim, cotton, a baseball cap, what looked like a high-visibility vest, the kind hunters wear, a single boot upright on the bank like someone had set it there. I counted 14 distinct items of clothing around the visible perimeter of the pool before I stopped counting. Some of them were recent, still holding their color, still intact. Others were faded, mud-stained, beginning to deteriorate. One item, a jacket, was so degraded that it was nearly part of the bank itself, woven into the mud and roots. I photographed everything. My hands were steady, which surprised me because the rest of me was not. I had that feeling you get when you realize you're somewhere you shouldn't be, not in a trespassing sense, but in a deeper way. Like the place itself doesn't include you in its logic, like you're foreign matter. The swamp has never made me feel that way, not in 9 years. This place did. I didn't enter the pool. I'm not sure I could explain exactly why. The boat was fine. The water looked calm. There was no visible hazard. But something about the blackness of the water, the depth finder malfunction, the warmth of it, the silence, something told me not to go further. And I listened. I backed the boat out slowly, through the entire length of the channel, watching the banks slide past with their thousands of oval marks. It took me about 20 minutes. When I reached the open basin water, the sounds came back immediately. A green heron called from somewhere to my left. A fish broke the surface. The wind moved. The world resumed. I went home that night and spread out my chart on the kitchen table. I extended the bearing line south-southeast from my last plotted point. If the line continued, it ran through the area where I'd found the channel, through the pool, and then continued out into the lower basin toward the coast. If I extended it all the way, it reached the Gulf of Mexico at a point roughly between Marsh Island and Point Au Fer. Open water. Nothing there. But I didn't believe in the line anymore. Not as a line, because what I'd found at the pool suggested that the bearing wasn't pointing towards something out there. It was pointing towards something here. The pool. The channel. Whatever was at the bottom of that black water. Whatever had been at the bottom of it for however long those clothes had been accumulating. I couldn't sleep that night. Not from fear, exactly. From the weight of what I'd seen, and the complete absence of any framework to understand it. I'm not a superstitious person. I don't believe in swamp monsters or haunted waterways or any of that. I believe in hydrology and biology and the very straightforward ways that people die in the basin. Heat exhaustion, drowning, snake bite, gator attack, alcohol, bad judgment, bad luck. I've seen all of those. They make sense. They have mechanisms. They have explanations that fit inside reality. What I'd found didn't fit. The next week, I requested records from the Iberville, St. Martin, and Assumption Parish Sheriff's offices, every missing persons report, filed for the basin region going back 20 years. This was within my scope as an enforcement agent conducting a wildlife patrol review. I framed it as a safety assessment for recreational boaters. It took a few weeks, but I got them. 138 missing persons reports in 20 years. Some were resolved. People found alive, people found deceased, clear circumstances. But 43 of them were never resolved. 43 people who went into the basin and were never found. No body, no vehicle, no boat, no trace. That number seemed high to me, but I wasn't sure, so I pulled comparable figures for other large waterway systems in the state. The Pearl River Basin, the Sabine, Calcasieu. Their unresolved rates were much lower. 12 in 20 years for Pearl River, 8 for Sabine, 6 for Calcasieu. 43 was not a normal number. I started going through the 43 case files individually. This took weeks. I was doing this on my own time at the kitchen table after shifts. My wife noticed. She asked what I was working on, and I told her it was a safety review, which was technically true. She didn't press, but she gave me a look that said she knew there was more. We'd been married long enough for those looks. What I found in the case files wasn't dramatic. It was cumulative. Small consistencies that no one would notice across individual reports, but that stood out when you read 43 of them in sequence. In 31 of the 43 cases, the person was last seen or last known to be in the northern or central basin. In 27 of those 31, the vehicle or vessel, if recovered, was found south or south-southeast of the last known position. The same bearing, the same direction, across 20 years of cases. In 19 cases, the vessel was recovered in orderly condition, or with no signs of struggle. In 11 cases, the report specifically mentioned that personal effects were present and undisturbed. In 8 cases, there were notes about clothing being found in the area, sometimes on the person's boat, sometimes on nearby banks. In 3 of those 8 cases, the clothing was described as folded or neatly placed. Nobody had cross-referenced these reports. Each parish handled its own cases. The sheriff's offices didn't share data systematically. LDWF didn't track missing persons as part of its mandate. The cases existed in separate filing cabinets, in separate parishes, handled by separate deputies, and no one had ever laid them side by side. I built a spreadsheet. I built a timeline. I built a map with all 43 unresolved cases plotted, color-coded by decade. The south-southeast pattern was visible across all 20 years. It wasn't getting stronger or weaker over time. It was constant. 2 to 3 cases per year, every year, all pointing the same way. I brought the spreadsheet to Doucet. This time, he didn't deflect. He looked at it carefully. He scrolled through the entries. He looked at the map I'd printed, and then he said something that I think about every day. He said, "Saunier knows about this." Saunier was the regional captain, Doucet's boss, 3 levels above me. I asked what he meant. Doucet shook his head. He said, "I'm not telling you anything. I'm telling you that you're not the first person to notice the direction." He wouldn't say more. He told me to go home. He looked tired, not angry, not defensive. Tired in a way that went past a long shift. Tired in a way that looked like it had been there for years. I didn't go to Saunier. Something about the way Doucet said his name made me not want to. Instead, I went back to the channel. This time, I brought equipment. A portable sonar unit, better than my hull-mounted one, and a weighted rope with depth markings. I wanted to know how deep that pool was. The The sonar had been giving me bad readings, but a weighted rope doesn't malfunction. I reached the pool around 10 a.m. on a clear January morning. The air was in the mid-40s, which was normal. The water in the pool was 73 degrees, which was not. I deployed the sonar first. It showed the same erratic readings. 14 feet, then 20, then a spike to 40, then signal loss. I set it aside. I lowered the weighted rope from the center of the pool. It sank slowly. 10 feet, 20 feet, 30 feet, 40. At 40 feet, the rope was still descending. I had a 100-foot rope with me. At 50 feet, I felt no resistance. The weight was still falling. 60 feet, 70. At 80 feet, the rope went slack. Not slack like it hit bottom. Slack like the weight was no longer pulling. As if something had taken the tension out of the line. I held the rope in my hands and felt nothing. No weight, no pull, just limp nylon hanging in the water. I pulled the rope up. It came freely. Too freely, with no water resistance. When the end cleared the surface, the weight was gone. The clip was still there, but it was open. The carabiner that had been holding the 2-pound lead weight was open. I'd closed it myself. I'd checked it. Carabiners don't open by themselves underwater. Nothing snagged it. The rope was clean, no abrasion, no damage. The weight was just gone. I sat in the boat for a long time after that. The silence pressed in from all sides. The dark water didn't move. The oval marks on the bank seemed to watch me, which is an insane thing to say. But that's what it felt like. Like the geometry of the place was aware of me. I left. When I got back to the launch, I checked my GPS track. The path I'd taken was recorded normally through the main basin, into the feeder channel, down to the pool, but the track showed something I hadn't noticed in real time. My speed through the channel had been recorded as consistently 2.3 miles per hour, which was correct. I'd been idling, but the GPS also showed that I'd been in the channel for 47 minutes. At 2.3 miles per hour for 47 minutes, I should have covered about 1.8 miles. The channel wasn't 1.8 miles long. When I'd first found it, I'd estimated it at a quarter mile, maybe a third at most. I went back to my chart. I measured the distance on the GPS track. According to the track data, the channel was 1.8 miles long. The channel was getting longer. Or I'd misjudged the first time. Or the GPS was wrong. Or something else. I want to pause here and be honest. By this point, I was not sleeping well. My wife had started asking direct questions. Not about the research specifically, but about me. Was I okay? Was something wrong at work? I told her I was fine, which was not true. I was preoccupied. I was spending my off hours staring at charts and spreadsheets. I was making unauthorized extensions to my patrol route. I was going into the field alone and not telling anyone where I was going. I was behaving from the outside like someone who was losing it. I understand that. I understood it at the time. But I also had photographs of 14 items of clothing arranged around a pool of black water that was at least 80 feet deep in the middle of a floodplain swamp where the maximum natural depth is maybe 12 feet. I had temperature readings that contradicted every hydrological principle I'd been trained on. I had a bearing pattern in 20 years of missing persons data that no one had investigated. These were not delusions, they were measurements. In February, I made one more trip to the pool. This time, I almost didn't go. I'd been arguing with myself for a week about it. The rational part of me said to report what I'd found to someone. The state police, the FBI, an academic researcher, anyone. And step away, The other part of me said that no one would take a wildlife agent seriously who came to them with stories about a warm pool in the swamp and a bunch of old clothes. I'd sound like a crank. I'd sound like someone who'd been alone on the water too long. So I went back, one more time, to get better documentation. Better photographs, more measurements, maybe a water sample that could be analyzed. I reached the channel entrance around 8 a.m. The morning was overcast, mild, in the low 60s. The basin was alive. Egrets, cormorants, a pair of wood ducks that flushed as I came through. Normal. When I turned into the channel, the sounds stopped, the same as always. The transition was instant, like closing a door. The channel was different. The oval marks on the banks were gone. The mud was smooth, unmarked, as if they'd never been there. The dark vegetation was still present, but it seemed thicker, higher on the banks. The water was darker, and the channel was wider, not by a lot, maybe 2 feet on each side, but enough that I noticed. My boat had been a tight fit before. Now there was clearance on both sides. I moved slowly. The depth finder held steady at 6 feet. The temperature read 76 degrees. I reached the pool. The clothing was gone, every piece. The bank around the pool was bare mud, smooth, unmarked. No depressions, no fabric, no boot, nothing. As if the entire perimeter had been cleaned. The pool itself looked the same. Black, still, impenetrable. I deployed the sonar. This time it worked. It showed a clear bottom at 22 feet. A flat, hard bottom, not 80 feet, not 40, 22. I lowered a new weighted rope. It hit bottom at 21 feet, consistent with the sonar. I pulled it up. The weight was still attached. Everything was normal. Everything was exactly what it should have been, except that it contradicted everything I'd seen before. The pool was shallower. The marks were gone. The clothes were gone. The measurements were different. I sat in the center of that pool for over an hour. I took water samples. I took mud samples from the bank. I photographed the smooth, unmarked surface where I'd seen 100 oval depressions 3 weeks earlier. The photographs from my previous visits were on my phone. I could flip back and forth depressions, smooth, clothing, bare, deep, shallow. One reality, then another. I went home. I sent the water samples to a private lab in Baton Rouge that a friend from college worked at. I asked him to test for mineral content, biological indicators, temperature anomalies, anything unusual. The results came back 2 weeks later. The water was fresh, slightly acidic, consistent with swamp water, high in dissolved organic matter, no unusual minerals, no unusual biological markers, no anomalies. Normal swamp water. By March, I was done. Not because I'd solved anything or found any answers, because I'd reached the edge of what I could do alone, within the scope of my position, with the tools available to me. And because the place had started to feel different in a way I couldn't measure. The last few times I'd been in that channel, I'd had the sensation of being watched. Not by eyes, not by an animal, but by the landscape itself, by the geometry, by the silence. It felt like the swamp in that area was paying attention to me the way I'd been paying attention to it. And it didn't want more attention. That sounds like paranoia. Maybe it was. I'm not above that possibility. I filed a formal report, not with LDWF. I didn't trust the institutional silence around it, the way Doucet had said Saulnier's name, the way my questions had been deflected without ever being refused. I filed a report with the Louisiana State Police, Bureau of Investigations. I included the spreadsheet, the map, the bearing analysis, the photographs from the pool, and the channel, the temperature data, the GPS tracks, the clothing descriptions, the case cross references. I received a form letter acknowledging receipt. I never received a follow-up. 4 months later, I resigned from LDWF. The official reason was personal. The real reason was that I couldn't patrol those waters anymore knowing what I knew and not knowing what I didn't. I couldn't run my route past the entrance to that channel and not go in, and I couldn't go in again. I still live in Louisiana. I still go fishing, but not in the basin, not anywhere near it. My wife and I moved to Gonzales, which is east of Baton Rouge, close to the Amite River. Different watershed, different water. I work in construction supply now. It's fine. I still have the chart. The blue dots and the red dots. The parallel lines running south-southeast. It's in a drawer in my office at home. Sometimes I take it out and look at it, not to study it, just to confirm that it's real, that I didn't imagine it. The paper is getting soft at the folds. The ink is starting to fade. I check the missing persons reports for the basin parishes online when I can find them. The numbers haven't changed. 2 to 3 per year, the same rate, the same steady disappearance. Last fall, I saw a small article in the Iberville Parish Weekly paper. A survey crew working for a pipeline company had flagged an anomaly in the lower basin, a thermal signature in their ground imaging data that didn't match any known geological feature. The article said the company had reported it to the Army Corps of Engineers and was awaiting a response. The article was 4 paragraphs long. I've searched for follow-up coverage. There isn't any. The thermal signature was located approximately 1 mile south-southeast of the pool. I don't know what's at the bottom of that water. I don't know what made the marks on the mud. I don't know where the clothes came from or where they went. I don't know why the measurements changed between visits. I don't know why 43 people over 20 years disappeared along the same bearing. But I know the bearing is real. I know the water is warm. I know the silence is total. And I know that something in the lower Atchafalaya Basin is operating on a logic that doesn't match anything I've been trained to understand. If you go into the basin, and I know people will, because people always do, stay north of Bayou Pigeon. Stay on the main channels. Stay where the birds are singing. If the birds stop, turn around. If the water gets warm, turn around faster. And if you find a channel that isn't on your map, running south-southeast, with smooth banks and dark water, and no sound at all, do not enter it. Don't photograph it. Don't measure it. Don't try to understand it. Just go. Because I think it learns. I think it adjusts. The marks were there, and then they weren't. The clothes were there, and then they weren't. The pool was deep, and then it wasn't. Each time I came back, the place had changed, as if it knew what I'd been looking for and had decided not to show it to me anymore. But the people are still disappearing. The bearing hasn't changed. Whatever is there, it didn't stop. It just stopped letting me see it. And that, more than anything I found or didn't find, is what keeps me up at night. Not that the swamp is hiding something, that it hid it from me specifically, that it knows the difference.